So we're in your United States history book, and we're on chapter 25, and we're in the last section, which is section 5. This section really, as I was going through and putting the pictures, it just brought tears to my eyes to see the devastation that war produced, especially World War II. And this is throughout the entire world. People were affected. Over 6 million people had died, including 400,000 Americans, and millions were wounded. And much of Europe and Japan and Russia, the Pacific Islands and such, was devastated. Even in Africa, it was devastation that occurred by the World War, affecting so many people, millions of people. Here we have pictures. As I was putting together these pictures, and I just started praying, because I put them together and just thinking, oh wow, this is where Rome was. Rome was destroyed. The Italians were destroyed. Paris was destroyed. Here these kids are looking up, from the trenches of London, and here we have these young Americans and Australians, and considered prisoners or such, taking here and being casualties of war. Here we have a Japanese soldier, young man, crying out here in the midst of the jungle areas. Here we have devastation, and the people there just looking up and seeing what's going to happen next. And then of course we have when we look, here's some pictures of the Holocaust. What happened to all these 6 million Jews that were put into death camps? And we're going to go into that a little bit. Here we have a European, I think a Czechoslovakian, or maybe it's Polish, but anyway, here he's looking onto the graveyards of his friends. And on here we have a Russian lady looking back, as Russia was devastated during this time too. So I was looking through all of this, and then in the midst, here we have the starvation in the concentration camps that was devastating. They starved, Hitler had many starved, not only Jews, but also Polish and Czechoslovakian and Christians, were killed and starved to death, and here in all of this one here just made me cry, because I think all of the devastation, I thought, Lord, if I could just be there to tell this Japanese boy about Jesus, if I could tell these young army, GIs here about Jesus, if I could tell this Russian lady with her baby about Jesus, or this Polish guy looking down at the graveyard about Jesus, or the devastation of these Italians, and they're all looking, or into the islands I was looking, or these Jews, if I could go in and just tell them about the hope of Jesus. And then I have this picture here, and it's an American soldier, and there he is. He's looking at these, on the islands, he's looking at these young babies, these little kids, and he's feeding them his food and giving them something to eat and something to drink in the islands. I was thinking it was probably in Papua New Guinea. And here he is. And then Lord said, this is what I want you to do. Do the next thing that I have for you to do. And then I will do miracles. I'll bring you to the least of least. I'll bring you to Russia. I'll bring you to Israel. I'll bring you to Japan, wherever I go, to tell the world my story, the hope of God, and just give them something to eat, give them something to drink, give them some clothes, and then give them the hope that I offer in the Lord Jesus Christ. And look at this young man, this young American soldier, feeding, and just totally brought tears to my eyes. And that's what God wants us to do. After this war, the World War II was quite a few years ago now, but war is still going on, and there's still devastated areas of the world that need to hear the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. How to add that in? The effects of the war were horrific, but God is above all of this. The effects of the war, mankind is horrific. The heart of man is deceitfully wicked beyond measure. We found that out, didn't we? With all of these, these terrible the terrible despots and terrible military dictators of Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese general in the midst of all this, and just the devastation of the world, not caring for human life. We found that out. But God is above all, and he brings hope in the midst of the sorrows of war, the effects of war. So, one of the greatest effects they found after the war was the Holocaust. You can go to any Holocaust museum. There's one in Israel. There's one in Washington, D.C. You can go where concentration camps were in Poland and Auschwitz and stuff and see the devastation. Some people don't even believe it because it's so anti-Semitic. You see, the enemy is the enemy of this world. That Satan, the cult, Satan is against Israel, is against Christians, yes, but also against Israel, because Jesus is going to return and sit on the seat, on the throne of David. And he knows that, so he wants to destroy Israel. So at this time, Israel was not even a nation, so Israel became a nation after the war, World War II. So the world then discovered the vast extent of Hitler's corruption. Adolf Hitler and his Nazis had set out to exterminate all of Europe's Jews, 10 to 15 million of them. Hitler hated Jews and blamed them from the problems of Europe. He was keeping the Aryan race, the German race, from achieving its full potential. Not him, but the Jews were keeping the Aryan race from achieving its full potential. In his book called Mein Kampf, Hitler indicated that the Aryan race was destined to bring in human progress. He basically said there was a superior race and he was it, right? And to do so, the Germans should enslave and in some cases eliminate the lower races, the Jews and others, from the planet. Just eliminate certain people and enslave everybody else. And that's what he took out to do. He was going to conquer the world and enslave the world and make the Aryan race the upper class race, the controllers, right? So Hitler justified this with the philosophy of social Darwinism. Darwin said that natural selection to human society was the survival of the fittest, and he believed the Aryan race was the fittest. So here he took Darwinism and put it into social Darwinism, basically saying, that we have a superior race and the rest of the races are inferior, and so we should get rid of some of them, and enslave the others. So here's some pictures of, never forget, you have the concentration camp of Auschwitz here. Here's what the label they put on the star on them to say that they were Jewish. Here's all their shoes, piles of shoes. I could barely get through this. This is like really devastating, to see how this could even happen, I have to say something about Adolf Hitler. If you investigate, his life, his grandfather, he didn't know his grandfather. His dad didn't know who his father was. So basically, his grandfather, was possibly one of we're talking about grandfather, was possibly, they say, Jewish. They actually did a DNA test of Hitler and found out that he was 1/4 Ashkenazi Jew, which Ashkenazi Jew could be Jew, could not be Jew. We don't, as for, the Rothschilds. And his grandmother was a maid for Baron Rothschild. So in the midst, he might be descended of the Rothschilds. I really do not believe the Rothschilds are even Jewish, but in the midst of that, they were the beginnings of the Illuminati, Satan-type cult, and the Jesuits had come in. So, he may have been used as a puppet in some cases for the powers of Satan through the Illuminati, so that's just, he was very much satanic. Probably to do all this had to be possessed by the devil, I am sure. So, and when you say that, they say that he was Jews, I believe he was a descendant of the Rothschilds, but I really don't believe that they're really Jewish. So anyway, you can investigate that whole thing. That's for you to do. Hitler's concentration camps and death camps. In 1933, Hitler began a systemic yet secret government program of denying Jews civil rights and letting them, in some cases, be victims of mob violence. So he was bringing them, into, basically taking away, their rights, taking away their homes, bringing them into the slum areas and such, and having them be victims. He had this since 1933, way before World War II. And the Nazi government began these pogroms against the Jews, killing Jews. So they began this. Incited by the Nazi propaganda, crowds of angry Germans attacked defenseless Jews and burned their homes, businesses, and their synagogues down. In 1941, we're talking about 1941 in World War II, all Jews had been denied all basic rights and their property seized. In certain countries, he conquered the countries that were conquered by the Nazis. And also in Germany, the Jews were gathered and executed on the spot or shipped by railroad to war factories or to concentration camps. Some of the biggest concentration camps were Dachau, Treblinka, Auschwitz. They were the largest. But here you have a bunch. Here's a picture here. Here's Germany. Here's Poland. Here's Auschwitz, one of the worst death camps ever. Treblinka, another. These are all Nazi. The red are death camps. Many were killed at these camps. And then over here we have these other camps here, which we have the women's camp here was Ravensbrück. And these were all concentration, some of them work camps in the midst of Germany, outside of Germany here too. So this is Poland, terrible, terrible. So you can see the picture here. I have a hard time going on with this, so just, but see how they treated people so horrifically. Called this genocide. The Nazi Germany had efficient bureaucracy to direct the systemic murder of an ethnic group, and that was called genocide. So they were trying to get rid of a whole race of people, a whole ethnic group, a whole culture, the Jews. Several prominent leaders would go down in history along with Hitler as these human monsters. Here's some pictures. They look like normal people, these four guys here, and these all, a lot of them too, they were human monsters. Hermann Göring, Hitler's Reich Marshal. Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS. He had overseen the concentration camps and the mass killings of many civilians. Heinrich Himmler. Adolf Eichmann, the director of the SS Office for Jewish Deportation. Right here. These guys, Hermann Göring, Adolf Eichmann, or Heinrich Himmler, Adolf Eichmann. This is Eichmann up here. And then Rudolf Franz Haas, this guy here. He was the commandant of Auschwitz concentration camp. Monsters indeed. Now, you can just look at some of these pictures. I put them together. You can see here's Auschwitz. You can see the devastation of them going thinking they're going to a work camp, not realizing many of them were going to be exterminated. That many were going to be brought into a death camp, and they were going to give poison gas and die. A lot of the children died, a huge amount of children, because they thought that children basically, weren't. They'd have to take care of them, so. Weren't viable workforce, so anyway, take a couple seconds there just to look at these pictures. death camps. The extermination camps. I just picked some. Here's Anne Frank, famous. She wrote diaries before. Some of the young, pretty Jewish kids that were handsome kids that were, a lot of them put on work camps or extermination camps. So after arriving at a camp, the terrified and exhausted prisoners would be taken from railroad cars and divided into two groups. A healthy group would be sent to work in the factories or into a concentration work camp. The sickly group or children would be sent to the gas chambers, or sometimes used in laboratory experiments. The division was made by the chief camp physician. The enclosed gas chambers were disguised as showers. They thought they were going in to take showers. The people were told to undress and were packed into the chamber. And then the chamber was filled with poison gas. Their bodies, their corpses, were pulled out and stacked before mass crematoriums and burned. Other less fortunate victims were sent to laboratories or sadistic and deadly medical experiments made by the Nazi physicians. How horrible. How horrible could this be? You can imagine the world look on when they found out that this is the whole world looking and saying, what monsters? What monsters? Remembering the Holocaust, 6 million Jews were exterminated. 6 million. As well, including, well, when I say as well, more than 6 million Jews plus a lot of Germans, Poles, Russians, Slavs, homosexuals, communists, and many Christians were slaughtered. There were a lot of Christians that were slaughtered too, that were exterminated. Polish, I think they were like, how many Poles died? You know, I'm talking about probably up to close to 6 million Poles too, that were exterminated too. This horrible massacre is remembered today as the Holocaust. Here's a picture. They just have, you can go to the museum and see all of their pictures. It says, here's Auschwitz. For the dead and the living, we must bear witness. Elie Wiesel. Here you see, this is the little girl looking at back at the history of the Holocaust. We need to remember. We need to remember what happened. And the Jews said, never again. And from this point, they would go and Israel would be made a nation. And a lot of Holocaust victims then that were set free, they had no place to go, but they knew that God would raise up, and God raised up Israel, and a lot of them came to the mainland of Israel. And that's another story, another video. I can't go through that whole thing right now, but amazing miracle of Israel becoming a nation, despite all, all of the warfare against that happening. The war crimes trials were in Nuremberg, from 1945 to 1949, many of the Nazi leaders were put on trial in Nuremberg, Germany. At the first session, many Nazis were convicted, but few executed or imprisoned. The most shocking fact, can you believe, the most shocking fact was that many German people, not just a few fanatical Nazi racists, had witnessed much of the brutality and oppression and had given their approval. Wow. A lot of the German people just turned their head and allowed it to happen. And they even gave their approval on this and the extermination of the Jews. That is the most shocking fact of the trials, is that a lot of the German people had approved. This fact demonstrates the spiritual and moral bankruptcy of a nation that accepts the teachings of Darwinism, humanism, and socialism. That's where the Nazis took a stand. They stood that they were the superior race, and they stood on humanism and socialism, not anything to do with God, right? Not anything to do with Christianity. So if our country would go with Darwinism, humanism, and socialism, we could be the same place as the German people were back then, allowing people to be, and children to be murdered. That's the heart of man, deceitfully wicked beyond measure. Here's a picture of the Nuremberg trials. Then on to the Tokyo trials. In 1946 to 1949, many Japanese officials were put on trial in Tokyo, Japan, for crimes against humanity and peace. 7 men, including General Tojo, were sentenced to death. Another 16 were sentenced to life in prison. And several other trials occurred throughout Asia, and the trials of Tokyo were the most prominent trials, though. So we see these trials going on in Tokyo against those Japanese leaders that had done some horrific things. Wartime conferences. Now we're changing. That's terrible, but now the conferences were going on. And during the war, these conferences had argued what was going to happen to all these nations after the war. The first conference happened during the wartime at Tehran in Persia. That's in Iran now today. It's controlled by a Muslim nation today. But on November 28th to December 1st, 1943, Churchill and President Roosevelt, this is before President Roosevelt died in 1945, of course, and Stalin, here's a picture of him up here at Tehran. So, and they met together, they were going to try to figure out what's going to happen after the war. So we have Stalin of Russia, we have Roosevelt of America, and we have Churchill of Great Britain. So, and then we have the Yalta Conference, and that happened in Yalta, which is in Russia, Crimea. So we have in Russia, Roosevelt on February 4th to the 12th in 1945. This is almost over 2 years later. Roosevelt, this is right before Roosevelt dies too. He looks very sick there, doesn't he? He meets again, and they meet again at the Yalta Conference again to describe what's going to happen at the end of the war. And they're looking forward, to basically the war in Europe actually was right on the verge of coming to an end. And in May, actually it did. So the Potsdam Conference, that was the last conference. There actually was more than these 3, but these are the 3 main. The Potsdam Conference was in Germany, and now this is after Roosevelt dies by a stroke, and President Truman is here now. So we have President Truman, we have Prime Minister Attlee now of Great Britain, and we have again Stalin, the dictator of communist Russia, meeting to find out what do we do now. So at the Tehran Conference in Iran, in Persia then, was on November 28th to December 21st, 1943. So what did they do? Well, they planned the future strategies to defeat the Axis powers, of course, and then they were looking at what was going to be done after the final victory. The big 3, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, met in Tehran. This is 1943, while the war is going on. The most important discussions centered on the fate of the liberated countries and a peacekeeping organization after the war. They wanted a peacekeeping organization. The conference was strained because Churchill had a keen understanding of the nature of communism and was very suspicious of Stalin. So here Churchill's looking to Stalin thinking, he's not going to do what he says. He's a dictator. And so he was he understood that communism was not good. He feared the Soviet dictator might move communist troops into the liberated areas, which we find later on he did indeed. So basically Churchill looked at Stalin like, he's a bad guy. He's a bad guy. So, but Stalin then denied, like, I have no such intentions. Of course he denied it, lying. And then Roosevelt accused Churchill of trying to hold on to the British Empire, saying, you're just trying to hold on to your colonies. So they had many problems. You can see that, especially between Churchill and Stalin. And so then Roosevelt believed at that time, as we've studied President Roosevelt, he believed in democratic socialism. So he believed in socialism, although he didn't believe in communism, but he kind of accepted a lot of things of communism, but he didn't see how horrific communism really was. So he basically was giving Roosevelt a lot of leeway in what happens after the war, thinking that Stalin would stand for something good, and he wasn't. Let's just say Stalin actually killed like 16 million people, in his own country, and starved out Ukrainian. That it was terrible, terrible, terrible things he did. He was actually a monster along with Hitler. But at that time, Roosevelt didn't really know all this. He thought socialism was okay. As we know, he was probably one of the main socialistic presidents in the United States at that time. But anyway, here we have a picture of him talking and getting along with communist dictator Joseph Stalin. Then at the Yalta Conference happened a couple years later on February 4th through 12th, 1945. So Roosevelt is sickly here, Roosevelt appeared at his last conference. Only the United States had the strength to stop the advance of communism, but Roosevelt saw no cause for concern for communism. He was not concerned with communism. And Stalin promised to enter the war in the Pacific, and Roosevelt promised to compensate him for damages done to Russia by the German invasion. So Stalin basically promised, that he'd come in at this point. He hadn't gone into the war in the Pacific with Japan. He hadn't declared war on Japan yet. Stalin hadn't, but he said he would. He promised that he would, but he wanted to make sure that he was going to be paid for damages done in Russia, that they paid damages as for European, as for what had been done in Russia. What areas of Russia were devastated by the Germans, and he wanted to make sure that he was being repaid for all that. And so Roosevelt made some concessions to the Soviet leader. First of all, it had to do this was horrific of the Polish government. So abandoning the Polish government wanted to rule themselves, of course. Roosevelt gave Stalin a large chunk of Poland. Stalin wanted Poland to be communist. Just take that in. He also was allowed to keep Manchuria and have Mongolia. And this would betray the nationalist Chinese leader. At that time was Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek at this time was fighting against, Mao Zedong taking over communism. And now he would have to fight against Stalin, Russian communism on the other side. And so basically Roosevelt had betrayed Chiang Kai-shek. And Chiang Kai-shek had always stood for America. That was very horrible. And so Roosevelt promised that all American troops would be withdrawn from Europe within 2 years. So he basically said in 2 years, he'd take all the troops out. The agreed troop withdrawal was later canceled when it became clear that Stalin's Red Army was not going to leave Eastern Europe and to march on the West. So basically, he said that we were going to take our American troops out. We ended up not. Why? Because Stalin did not withdraw troops at all. He was taking over countries later on, we'll see, with communism. So here's a picture of Yalta. The Potsdam Conference. Now this was a different nature now because President Roosevelt had a stroke and died. So now we have a vice president becoming president, Truman. So the summer of 1945, the Allies, their last conference was the Potsdam Conference, and that was adopted the declaration so that they could declare for Japan to surrender, right? And so they made the plans for occupation of Germany and Berlin and divided Germany and Berlin into 4 zones, military occupation. So the zones would be the American zone, the British zone, the French zone, and the Soviet zone. Remember, Berlin and Germany had been defeated. So they divided Berlin was the capital of Germany, and then Germany, they divided up to 4 different parts. And so the American, British, and French got together and they made West Germany. And they took over West Germany and West Berlin, which became a stronghold of Western, the Western economy, so the free enterprise system. And then the Russians refused to cooperate at this point, And they forced a communist dictatorship on East Germany and the capital of East Berlin too. So they basically came in, the communists says, well, we're taking in East Germany, and they're going to be communism. That's when they built the wall to separate the East from the West. At that point, the Berlin Wall, you know, to keep the East, keep the communism in. And so the rest of Eastern Europe would meet a similar fate, because basically Stalin would come in, communism would come in and control a lot of these Eastern countries, you know, at this time. Very sad indeed. So here we have the Potsdam Conference. We have Truman and deciding what they should do, you know, and dividing it up, and now not realizing what Stalin would do. So, and this is in Potsdam, Germany, the end of the war. The Cold War would begin. The big three at Potsdam would establish this coalition. You know, the government's composed of both communists and anti-communists, with the understanding of free elections. So what basically Truman said, you know, on when he was talking with the government of Great Britain too, basically they were saying, okay, as long as these countries can have free elections, they can elect if they want to be communist or if they want to be anti-communist, you know. But the presence of the Soviet troops made free elections a farce. Communism came in and never did give free elections at all, you know. So the communist dictatorships were quickly imposed upon the people of Eastern Europe. And as World War II came to an end, the Cold War, a conflict of opposing ideologies, had begun. The Cold War, again, communism against the free world. So here we have the Potsdam Conference, reparations, trying to give the Polish borders, and basically communism, communist Russia taking over, communist Soviet Union, I should say, taking over Poland, you know, and describing these things at the Potsdam. The Cold War has begun. Now we're going to talk about the United Nations, but let's stop there. We still have a few other things to talk about too. So we're going to get into, you know, also the United Nations, which today, I always say they're do nothing, but let's talk about how the United Nations were formed in the next video.